back in 1964 was liberalism surging forward. This was at the time, it was a year before Medicare was passed. It was when Barry Goldwater, the year later, lost the election by one of the worst defeats in American political history for presidency. Lyndon Johnson won with, what, 61%. And it seemed like the whole future of America was moving further to the left, more welfare programs, more liberalism, more favors for criminals, and the Supreme Court was making decisions to let criminals go free on technicalities. And nobody took seriously the possibility that there was a conservative alternative view to how we ought to organize ourselves. It seemed like this was just some goofy idea that a handful of people might have had. And we had to persist, even though there was no reason to think that the trend of history wasn't going to keep going the way it was, and it would just get more and more liberal, more statism, less individual freedom. That just seemed to be the trend. And it started with Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s, and it just kept building. And so we had sort of had an article of faith that we believed in our principles. We'd read the Declaration of Independence. A lot of us had read Atlas Shrugged, and we just believed that the country ought to be based on individual liberty and limited government and low taxes. I mean, all the same things we're arguing about today. And we had no reason to believe we were ever going to succeed. Ended up, eventually elected Ronald Reagan. The nation started turning around. And it struck me that what you folks are facing today as a couple of generations later, almost a half a century later, as you become activists for conservative and Republican principles, that your job is to finally end liberalism that has obviously failed. It's backpedaling all, this whole debt crisis is part of, I think, the death throes of liberalism. It's, I think if we jump forward another 20 years, my guess is history is going to show that the excesses of liberalism that resulted in the terrible debt situation we're in today ended up causing the end of the policies that gave rise to the debt that we couldn't sustain. And just as my generation's job was to sort of throw ourselves in front of this onrushing energy of liberalism, your job, I think, is going to be to finally drive it out of business. So I think you have a tremendous opportunity.
Republican field for president, and and basically, like, what candidates do you think potential candidates that might come out? One thing I know a lot of people are saying Rick Perry, and one of the things I've heard is that the Democrats would just use against him. Well, he was the lieutenant governor under George Bush. George Bush did such a great job, and we'll just try to use that attack. What are your thoughts on the presidential field going into 2012?
It is usually the case that the opposition candidates for president look like pygmies compared to the president of the United States. Doesn't matter which party it is. I mean, Bill Clinton looked like a pygmy compared to George Herbert Walker Bush. He ended up beating him. But you're the president of the United States. You're flying in Air Force One. You have all the accoutrement of office. And these are just somebody standing up and saying, I want to be president of the United States. And you tend to look smaller because you're not the president. And so, I know, it was 20 years ago they were called the Seven Dwarfs, I think. I forget which party had the Seven Dwarfs. But every season, there's a disparagement of the opposition party's candidates for president. They're made fun of. How can they compare with whoever the current president is? And
Social Security, no, that's not. I mean, I think that they don't understand how much it's costing the country. And honestly, if you look at it, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the biggest Ponzi schemes going.
Yeah. Young lady, your hand up.
Oh. My name is Dane Wilson, and I'm from Utah. And a lot of my peers, they don't understand it at all. It just goes over their head. They're like, "What? Can we just stop Social Security?" And it's like, it costs a lot of money, but they can't grasp.
Do you guys ever, do you talk to your friends who are not in politics about these issues, or do they not want to hear about it, so you just don't do it, or just, I mean, how did, yeah.
A lot of the response that I get is that they're not old enough to vote. It doesn't affect them until they're 18. They don't want to hear about it.
You would say?
I'm Adam Travis. I'm from Arizona. And I take it a little bit step further than he did. And I'd say cut every entitlement that we have, at least turn it into something that has to be voted on every year, like any other budget we have or any other system. You can't just dole out money without anyone voting on it. And you said you went to a public school and teachers did that. I go to a private college prep school, which is like one of the most selective schools in Arizona.
Mhm.
And I don't know a single Republican teacher other than our advisor. Every other teacher after class is why liberalism is better than how that is.
Yeah. I guess some things haven't changed. Because it's a real challenge. I mean, it's fascinating because, you know, I've done national communicating, and you look at polls a lot, and you try to understand where the people are, and it's sometimes puzzling, the argument that seems so obvious to us. You know, we're moving from 4 workers to 1 retiree to when boomers are fully retired 2 to 1. There's no way we can tax our way, even if they wanted to, you can't tax enough of the generation that's going to continue to work after the boomers retire to pay for the benefits that we promised ourselves.